On February 24, 2022, the world was changed permanently. For Ukraine, this date is especially tragic as it truly opened the gates to hell, the bottom of which is still not visible. So many lives lost senselessly. And all in the name of the greatness of the new Russian Empire, and in the name of overcoming complexes that date back to the days of service in the KGB. The war was supposed to overcome the long-standing fear of a professional Chekist toward freedom of choice and democracy, which independent Ukraine embodied. That's why, for Putin, the full-scale invasion was by no means an accident or a hasty decision. Nothing compares to the 1969 football war between El Salvador and Honduras. For a true gatherer of Russian lands, an open war with the sovereign Ukrainian state became only the culmination of years of preparation, affecting all spheres of life in Russia, from restructuring the economy for Western sanctions to aggressive ideological indoctrination of the population. While many world leaders were still hoping for diplomacy and post-compromises, the terrible war machine had already been set in motion. The genie was out of the bottle. Today, we will break down how Putin prepared for the invasion of Ukraine over many years, analyze the main stages of this preparation, and try to understand exactly what motivated the Kremlin dwarf. At each stage, we will focus on what measures were taken to enable a rapid capture of Ukraine and a potential confrontation with the West. I will specifically not discuss what mistakes and strategic miscalculations the Moscow Tsar made. We will definitely dedicate a separate discussion to that topic. I also won't touch on events before 2015. We have many videos on our channel dedicated to various aspects of the hybrid stage of the Russian-Ukrainian war, including the annexation of Crimea and the beginning of the conflict in Donbass. I strongly recommend everyone to watch them and refresh your memory about events that happened more than a decade ago. Now we are moving on to more recent events. My name is Semyon. This is the Mega Show television channel. We have only facts and analysis. Let's go. Minsk 2. A strategic crossroads. By signing the already largely forgotten Minsk agreements on an early February morning in 2015, Russia found itself facing an unpleasant dilemma. Although, for legal accuracy, it should be emphasized that Putin didn't actually sign anything in Minsk at that time. The signature on the document was left by a real scapegoat. Russian ambassador to Ukraine, Mikhail Zurabov, can't be held responsible. Especially since a year later he was recalled to Moscow, and that was the end of his political career. Well, that's fine. He'll have to deal with it. But now let's get back to our main topic. Minsk 2 put a halt to active hostilities, turning the military conflict from a series of intense clashes into a permanent and sluggish one, without major offensives and, most importantly, with minimal casualties on both sides. Although it never fully froze. And for the next 7 years, right up until the full-scale invasion, there were almost constant shootouts and actions by various sabotage and reconnaissance groups along the front line. But they didn't pose any real threat to either side. That's why the war in Donbass gradually faded into the background, both in the Ukrainian and Russian information space. And after a couple of years, it became more like background noise, similar to the conflict in the Middle East. Everyone knows about it, everyone keeps it in mind, but everyone got used to it and doesn't pay much attention to it. But the Kremlin didn't forget about it, or rather, its permanent master. He understood perfectly well that the series of special operations in 2014, which could be grouped under the general name Project Novorossiya, had been finally and irreversibly buried. They failed to divide Ukraine internally, federalize it, or restore pro-Russian forces to power. The only real assets gained were the isolated Crimean Peninsula and a few small areas in Donbass, known as the Donetsk People's Republic and Luhansk People's Republic, which wasn't much. However, this was nowhere near the level the uncrowned little Tsar had counted on a year earlier. The Ukrainian state survived, stayed intact, regrouped, and started to strengthen, raising questions about its future, how to shape Russian-Ukrainian relations, and which strategy to follow. The most logical and rational thing in this situation would be to forget about Ukraine, as psychologists say, to let go of the problem. Moreover, after all the bloody events of 2014, Ukraine could no longer, by definition, be a friendly state towards Moscow. But could the new gatherer of Russian lands allow such a thing? Could Russia truly become an empire without Ukraine, without the so-called sacred lands, without Kyiv? Certainly not, especially not in the fevered mind of a former KGB officer who saw himself as both Emperor of Russia and General Secretary at once. That's why Ukraine had to be urgently brought back into the Russian world, otherwise it could finally and irreversibly drift to the West. The only question was how exactly to bring it back. Should Ukraine be forced back with military might, or should it be returned to the sphere of influence through softer political and diplomatic means? Peace Putin style. In 2015, those around Putin and Putin himself were leaning toward the second peaceful path, well, relatively peaceful, without a full-scale invasion. And in Donbass, they continued to act as before, using hybrid tactics, insisting in the spirit of "they're not there." The main part of this strategy was the Minsk agreements, which implied the reintegration of the uncontrolled part of Donbass into Ukraine with very broad autonomy. The presence of such an openly pro-Russian enclave inside Ukraine would inevitably have changed the electoral balance, strengthened pro-Russian sentiments within Ukrainian society, and in general would have blocked the further course of the Ukrainian authorities toward the European Union and NATO. Another part of Putin's strategy to restore control over unyielding Ukraine was the support of pro-Russian political forces. First, the remnants of the Party of Regions under the opposition platform For Life, led by Putin's godfather Viktor Medvedchuk. There was also focus on smaller parties and public organizations like the Nash Party of Yevgeny Murayev, Anatoly Shary Party, opposition bloc of Vadim Novinsky, the Ukrainian Choice Organization, which laundered Moscow funds, and groups linked to the Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate. A separate video could focus on pro-Russian forces' activities in Ukraine. So, if you want to learn a lot of interesting things about figures who presented themselves as great patriots but were actually working in the interests of the Kremlin, let me know in the comments. However, despite the political and diplomatic strategy, Putin still kept the scenario of a direct military invasion in mind. In any case, a number of actions directly point to this. This is, first of all, preparation for new economic sanctions, which would inevitably follow in the event of open Russian aggression. Yes, in 2014 sanctions were also imposed, but they were rather superficial and cosmetic. This time the West definitely wouldn't have limited itself to symbolic gestures. Gold and foreign currency reserves were rapidly accumulated, reaching a record high of about $643 billion by early 2022. The Russian central bank steadily de-dollarized its reserves, swapping United States dollars for Chinese yuan. In 2017, Russia launched its own payment system, Mir, to prepare for possible exclusion from Visa and MasterCard. Russia also deliberately maintained one of the lowest levels of government debt in the world, about 18% of gross domestic product, to deprive the West of a possible leverage through debt obligations. Such measures also include the construction of Nord Stream 2, which began in 2016. And this was not just another gas pipeline bypassing Ukraine or an additional flow of gas dollars into the Russian budget. This project was supposed to tie the European and primarily German elites even closer to Russia, make Europe more dependent on Moscow, and accordingly less loyal to Ukraine. After the full-scale war began, Angela Merkel wrote in her memoirs that she originally saw Nord Stream 2 serving opposite purposes. In order to tie Putin more closely to Europe and by providing him with windfall profits, make a potential invasion of Ukraine economically disadvantageous. So each side tried to use the other for completely opposite purposes. And as for who outplayed whom in the end, you know that just as well as I do. See Paris and fly away. The checkpoint that was supposed to confirm or disprove Putin's plans was 2019, the year of the presidential and parliamentary elections in Ukraine. And at first glance, everything seemed to be going very well for the Kremlin. The young, inexperienced, and notably apolitical Volodymyr Zelenskyy achieved a decisive victory. Although he didn't consider himself exactly loyal to Moscow, he definitely wasn't among its staunchest opponents either. Moreover, the new president of Ukraine openly stated that he was ready to negotiate with anyone, even the devil himself, to end the war. He also spoke Russian and had long-standing ties to the Russian show business scene. The combination of these factors inspired clear optimism in the Kremlin, but no matter how high Putin's expectations were, the disappointment was many times greater. Zelenskyy made no concessions and firmly refused to implement the political part of the Minsk agreements. especially the point that concerned the procedure for holding elections in the occupied territories and control over the border. Moscow consistently insisted that local elections should take place first, and only then should control over the border be transferred to Ukraine, rightly believing that this way it would be able to secure the maximum result for pro-Russian forces by bringing various vacationers and simply Russian citizens into the territories of the so-called Donetsk People's Republic and Luhansk People's Republic. Ukraine insisted on restoring border control before agreeing to elections, following the money in the morning, chairs in the evening principle. Putin's last hope was for a personal meeting with the new Ukrainian president. On December 9, 2019, the last Normandy 4 meeting occurred with Putin, Zelenskyy, Macron and Merkel. But here too, the Kremlin leader faced another failure. Zelenskyy refused to make any concessions, making it clear that Ukraine was not going to return under Russian influence, even in such a covert, hybrid way through the Donetsk People's Republic and Luhansk People's Republic. What finally convinced Putin of the need to wage war differently, in a more friendly and healthy way. Reviving the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics was impossible, and Putin didn't want to wait for the 2024 elections. Age was catching up with him. There were no guarantees a pro-Russian candidate would win, even in the distant future. It was then that these thoughts finally took root in the mind of the new leader of the people. Back then, either in the Elysee Palace or on the way back to Moscow aboard the super comfortable plane. One thing became absolutely clear. The Paris summit directly demonstrated that without a direct invasion by Russia, using a large number of troops and equipment, it is completely unrealistic to carry out its imperial plans. And the clock started ticking, beginning the countdown. COVID hit at a bad time. It's true, there were still people in Putin's inner circle who were pushing for the continuation of the political and diplomatic track. This line was represented first and foremost by the new deputy head of the presidential administration, Dmitry Kozak, who, by the way, was an ethnic Ukrainian from the Kirovohrad region. He was the one who insisted on continuing negotiations with Ukraine on Donbass and personally led the negotiating team. Putin didn't particularly object, but he was already placing his main bet on the military scenario. However, chance once again disrupted the Tsar's plans, postponing them for at least a year. An unforeseen force majeure in the form of the COVID-19 coronavirus pandemic, which broke out at the beginning of 2020 and swept across the entire world, including Russia, in a matter of weeks. Russia, Peru, Bulgaria, and Mexico had unusually high death rates. Official data shows at least 400,000 people died from the coronavirus. Still, with Russia, actual data may differ. According to the guidelines for calculating excess deaths, the real number of deaths ranged from 1 to 1.2 million people. The authorities deliberately concealed the true situation, openly manipulated the numbers, specifically performed autopsies on the deceased, and did not include those who died from the consequences of coronavirus in the official statistics. And locally, as always, the governors themselves were interested in not spoiling the picture, to look good in front of the Kremlin, and God forbid, not to ruin anyone's career. Moreover, the phenomenally low numbers were also used for propaganda, claiming that we were handling the situation with Korea better than the decaying West. In general, you could make a separate video about the coronavirus in Russia, but let's get back to our topic. In short, throughout 2020, Putin definitely wasn't thinking about war. Due to the pandemic, many internal issues arose, including unexpected economic interventions. In reality, business support was modest, no more than 10% of gross domestic product compared to 25–30% in the United States and Germany. Moreover, the strategy of the Russian authorities was mainly aimed at supporting large corporations owned by oligarchs loyal to the Kremlin, rather than flooding the economy with money on a large scale like Western countries did. The pandemic created another problem, a purely psychological one, in the already troubled mind of the aging security officer. As all possible sources confirm, Putin was mortally afraid of catching the virus, having waited for the revival of the empire of his dreams. That's why there were months of self-isolation, meetings only in video conference format, and the extremely long 5-meter table, so that, God forbid, none of the foreign leaders would cough on the Sanchelekov leader. It was at that time that another nickname stuck to Putin among his many others, the Bunker Grandpa, and in my opinion it's quite fair. Putin isolated himself from the world, stopped talking to most reasonable advisors, and became lost in fantasies of a new Russian empire. He was helped by First Deputy Chief of the Presidential Administration, Sergei Kirilenko, one of the few in the Kremlin elite with direct access to the bunker grandpa. Despite the pandemic, as numerous sources testify, he wholeheartedly agreed with his boss. It was time to put the West in its place, restore Russian influence in Europe, revive Russia's former greatness, and unite all historic Russian lands around Moscow. Who cares about Ukraine? No, there will be no Ukraine, and Kiev is the mother of Russian cities. As you can imagine, nothing good could come out of these conversations. Putin just got yet another confirmation of the correctness of his ideas. However, the Kremlin old man not only sat in the bunker and was afraid of every sneeze and pop, but he was also preparing for war, at least internally. This fits into the context of resetting Putin's presidential terms, which allowed him to run for a fifth and even a sixth term. That's one. I've already lost count. The most interesting thing is that the decision on the legality of such a dismissive attitude toward the Constitution was made by the Constitutional Court, which 22 years earlier, in 1998, had ruled that Yeltsin could not run for a third term. As the saying goes, the law is like a wagon shaft, whichever way you turn it, that's how it goes. An even more crucial step in preparing for aggression was eliminating the last opposition forces from Russia's political scene, or simply from potentially dangerous individuals who could even hypothetically destabilize the situation from within. And such an individual was Alexei Navalny, the only representative of the so-called non-systemic opposition who remained in Russia and made a name for himself by fighting corruption. Among Putin's allies, he had Western support and was well known in Russia. If Ukraine were invaded, he could become a leading figure for liberal and anti-war groups. Accordingly, it was necessary to prevent the emergence of this center at all costs. That's why, in August 2020, Navalny was poisoned with a Novichok-type nerve agent, and when Putin's henchmen failed, he was jailed on fabricated charges for over 2 years. Then his sentence was extended. Navalny never got out of prison, and the political field was completely cleared to zero, so all that was left was to get on the horse and, with a song, go into battle as one people. As paradoxical as it may sound, when Putin decided to subdue rebellious Ukraine by military force, he actually wasn't really preparing for the war itself. In any case, preparations in the military sphere were extremely poor, and they were carried out mostly on paper and in various loyal reports sent up to Putin from below. Despite ongoing claims about rearmament and technical modernization of Russian troops, the first months of the full-scale war exposed the official statements as completely inconsistent. In any case, the overwhelming majority of captured equipment and weapons seized by Ukraine's defense forces are models from the 1970s and 1980s, some of which have been modernized, some not. T-72, T-80 tanks, BMP-2, BMP-3, armored vehicles, BTR-80 and Grad and Uragan multiple launch rocket systems. Even the self-propelled Gvozdika howitzers, discontinued long ago, are outdated weapons by 2022 standards. Apparently, Russian headquarters not only engaged in window dressing, but also, like Sergeant Shmatko, practiced embezzlement, kickbacks, and bribes. Russia's unpreparedness for a full-scale war was also evident in the fact that by the beginning of 2021, there were no large military groups along Ukraine's borders, except for the occupied territories of Donbass. 2 full army corps, totaling 35,000 people, were formed in the Donetsk People's Republic and Luhansk People's Republic directly under the Southern Military District Command in Rostov-on-Don. Russian units, totaling up to 100,000, began concentrating along the Russian-Ukrainian border and in occupied Crimea only in March-April 2021. However, due to the lack of infrastructure for conducting combat operations, such as field hospitals or large amounts of ammunition, it became clear to many that this was merely a show of force and a way to test the waters under the guise of exercises. Moreover, by mid-April, most of the group had returned to their permanent bases, but the regular Russian army had already caused quite a stir. Deciding to act preemptively, United States President Joe Biden initiated a personal meeting with Putin, which took place on June 16, 2021 in Geneva. Later, most experts assessed this summit as an unsuccessful attempt to prevent a disaster. The United States aimed to lower military confrontation risks and maintain the standoff with Russia, but didn't want to make major concessions to Moscow. Putin, already intent on changing power in Ukraine militarily, was testing the West's likely response to the planned invasion. As a result, many grand phrases were exchanged, but nothing practical came of it. They just agreed to continue negotiating. However, the most significant event of the summer of 2021 was an event that experts later called a kind of ideological justification for Russian aggression. This is a pseudo-historical article about the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians published on July 12, and its author was allegedly Putin himself. In fact, it was a group of Kremlin-backed historian propagandists led by Vladimir Medinsky, the same Medinsky who later headed the negotiation delegation in Istanbul. And in this article, which essentially looks like a political manifesto, Ukrainians were denied the right to national identity. It contained almost all the well-known propaganda clichés of the Kremlin. This includes the idea that Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians are one people, that modern Ukraine is an artificial state created by the Bolsheviks, that the West has turned Ukraine into an anti-Russia, and other similar pseudo-scientific nonsense. Let's examine one basic narrative. Russians and Ukrainians are one people. This is something new compared to the previously dominant mainstream historical concept. Since early Soviet times, the official ideology stated that Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians, while brotherly, are still different peoples. That is why Lenin and his followers never formally denied Ukrainians the right to their own identity, and even to their own statehood, creating a kind of simulacrum, a surrogate state called the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. Putin even denies Ukrainians the right to call themselves Ukrainians. He's surpassed the communists in absurdity. It's like brain evolution in reverse. There's no other way to put it. Our armor is strong and our tanks are fast. In the fall of 2021, preparations for the invasion of Ukraine entered their next decisive stage. In any case, this process had already become irreversible. Today, it can already be stated with certainty that in October, Putin gave orders to prepare a strike group and to amass troops along the Russian-Ukrainian border. Only this time it was no longer just for show. He also withheld the real purpose of these maneuvers from most of his inner circle and even from military district commanders. That's why many Kremlin elites, like Lavrov himself, sincerely believed that all this troop buildup was just for show, right up until that memorable strike on February 24. This was just part of a big bluff meant to scare the West and test their resolve. Only a few in Putin's Politburo understood where things were heading. And a few more people from the Russian General Staff, who most likely suspected it, since they were the ones who wrote these plans themselves. In any case, American and British intelligence received this top-secret information almost immediately after it came out of Putin's mouth. It's unclear who the mole in the Kremlin was, or if there were multiple. It's clear that the CIA and military intelligence, six knowing more about the Russian Führer's true plans than Russian ministers, is one of history's most successful intelligence operations. To disrupt these plans, the Americans and British authorized leaking the entire universe. And in the first days of November, a number of reputable publications, such as the Washington Post and Politico, began to write extensively that Russian troops were once again gathering along the border, and that this time the process would end with a direct attack. Just weeks later, nearly all Western media loudly claimed the invasion would happen in January or February 2022. Russia naturally denied all of these reports from the very beginning. The German publication Bild's article seemed prophetic, as in early December they published a map showing the main offensive directions. There was a strike on Kiev from Belarus, an attack on Kharkiv from Belgorod, and an assault from Crimea on Mariupol to establish a land corridor. Even though Russian officials at the time called this map nonsense and comics, the actual course of the invasion on February 24 matched these maps by about 80 to 90%. The only exception was the landing operation in Odessa, which was definitely planned but was not carried out due to a number of circumstances, including weather conditions. Western leaders tried to disrupt Russia's plans using more than just the press. On November 2, 2021, the head of the CIA and until recently the United States ambassador to Russia and an expert on Russian affairs, William Burns, visited Moscow. There he met with Patrushev, the second most powerful person in Putin's hierarchy, and informed him that the United States leadership was well aware of the plans for attacks, their scale, and so on. Burns also threatened new sanctions and warned Russia would be stuck in a prolonged war with Ukraine. Patrushev denied all claims. A month later, on December 7, there was a video call between Putin and Biden. The American president tried to reason with his Russian counterpart, but unsuccessfully. And a week later, Putin made a bold move by announcing his famous ultimatum. We have a separate video about it. I recommend everyone to watch it on purpose. I'll just remind you that with his demands to NATO, the Kremlin dwarf created a formal pretext for aggression against Ukraine, the so-called casus belli. Apparently, Russia claims it must defend itself from NATO's so-called eastward expansion. So, as Caesar said when crossing the Rubicon, the die is cast. You want decommunization? Well, that's fine with us. On the morning of February 7, 2022, sudden, unprecedented fighting erupted along the entire Donbas front line, unlike anything since the Minsk agreements. They orchestrated several provocations, the most infamous being the artillery shelling of a village kindergarten. The Luhansk authorities and the so-called Donetsk People's Republic and Luhansk People's Republic blamed everything on the Ukrainian military. This is despite the fact that in recent years, the conflict in Donbas had actually been subsiding. So, throughout the entire previous year, 2021, according to Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe data, no more than 30 people were killed on both sides, whereas, for example, in 2017, the number of casualties exceeded 100. Moreover, the last months of 2021 and the beginning of 2022 were completely quiet and stable. Previously, shootouts and civilians hitting mines were rare, but now there are thousands of violations and hundreds of explosions. Such an abnormal escalation compared to previous months and years was almost immediately described as completely man-made and orchestrated. In Moscow, preparations for a full-scale war have entered their final phase. By this time, the number of Russian troops on the borders with Ukraine had exceeded 200,000 people. And this time, mobile hospitals, field kitchens, and tons of fuel and lubricants had already been brought in. Even donor blood was delivered, which, according to military intelligence standards, is considered a 100% sign of a planned invasion. Most importantly, a strike group formed in Belarus for the main offensive on Kyiv. For this, joint Russian-Belarusian exercises called Union Resolve 2022 were used, which began on February 10. Thus, on completely legal grounds, Russian troops were able to concentrate 150 kilometers north of the Ukrainian capital. For the decisive push, all that was left was to paint the well-known Z and V symbols on the armor with fresh paint. Meanwhile, things were heating up more and more in Donbas, and even the brainwashed residents of the occupied territories realized that this time it didn't just smell like trouble, it was already blazing. And it would no longer be limited to the usual mortar and howitzer shelling. On February 18, Donetsk People's Republic and Luhansk People's Republic self-proclaimed authorities ordered a mandatory emergency evacuation of civilians from their territories. However, an analysis by British Broadcasting Corporation experts showed that the video announcing this very evacuation was actually recorded 2 days earlier. In other words, all these actions were part of a pre-planned bloody performance. On February 19th, forced mobilization was declared in the Donetsk People's Republic and Luhansk People's Republic, and local men were banned from traveling to Russia. Yes, few recall today, but mobilization was first used in this war in the occupied territories. This was despite mobilization not being announced in Russia until September 2022. And as for how the Russian army treated these mobiks from the unrecognized republics, it was a complete mess. Soldier Chmonia can confirm that. If you forgot this famous character, Google him to refresh your memory. He's quite colorful. However, in a word, for the Russian command, the poorly armed conscripts from the Donetsk People's Republic and Luhansk People's Republic looked more like bandits from the movie Wedding in Malinovka. They became real cannon fodder during the subsequent war, and even the Kmobiks themselves didn't hide it. However, these pseudo-republics wouldn't remain unrecognized for much longer. The turning point came on February 21 when, in the evening, Putin gathered his entire clique, called the Russian Security Council, in his lair. Moreover, the meeting was held in the same place where 8 years earlier, the so-called treaty on the annexation of Crimea to Russia was solemnly signed in the Catherine Hall of the Moscow Kremlin. Knowing the bald dwarf's fondness for symbolic or even sacred locations and dates, the choice of venue for this event was by no means accidental. And here's another twist for the whole world. It was announced as a live broadcast, although almost immediately it became clear, even to the naked eye, that it was a pre-recorded video with subsequent editing. And the meeting itself was held several hours earlier, so it's nothing more than cheap theatrics. The Kremlin's leader needed to show political unity before the invasion and bind everyone with shared guilt for what happened. Just like a mafia godfather binds his henchmen with the blood of victims. However, at that meeting, no one spoke about attacking Ukraine. God forbid, the mafia boss never revealed his true goal until the very end. Only one issue was put up for official discussion: the recognition of Russia, the Donetsk People's Republic, and the Luhansk People's Republic as independent states. Then came the usual tedious part, where Putin spent over an hour listening to loyal speeches about how cursed Ukraine had committed genocide in Donbass. By the way, this is where the well-known propaganda cliché comes from. Where were you for 8 years when Donbass was being bombed? Only 2 speeches stood out. Russian National Guard commander Viktor Zotov, to whom the Kadyrovites formally report, gave an aggressive speech saying it's not enough to just recognize their puppets, they should go further. Such an unusual outburst could only mean a direct hint at military expansion, but this time beyond Donbass itself. And the second was the head of the Foreign Intelligence Service, Sergei Narishkin, who was very nervous and stammered, trying in every possible way to dodge the question. When Putin pressed him, he blurted out that he allegedly supported the Donetsk People's Republic and Luhansk People's Republic joining the Russian Federation. And here, Narishkin not only let slip about Putin's further plans regarding Donbass. Apparently, due to his official position, he knew or suspected the real state of affairs in Ukraine. He knew the planned special operation would not be a walk in the park down Kreshchatyk. That devil couldn't have been unaware that most of the intelligence he used to feed his boss was complete nonsense. No one would greet the brave liberators with bread and salt. And now he was afraid that the truth would come out, but there was nothing he could do about it anymore. The wheels of war had been set in motion irreversibly. And one last touch, like after listening to the opinions of his subordinates, which meant nothing to him, Putin secluded himself for a couple of hours to meditate or to communicate with the spirits of Ivan the Terrible, Peter I, and Catherine II, who knows. He came out of his burrow and blurted out. As always, he began his next speech with a historical digression, which essentially expanded on the article he had written 6 months earlier about the unity of the Russian and Ukrainian peoples. He again claimed that Lenin created Ukraine at Russia's expense, and now insists he must urgently restore historical justice. In any case, this conclusion directly followed from the text. At the same time, the dictator recognized the Donetsk People's Republic and Luhansk People's Republic as sovereign states, but the main thing in his speech were the words that essentially foreshadowed the upcoming invasion. You want decommunization? Well then, that suits us just fine. But as they say, there's no need to stop halfway. We're ready to show you what real decommunization means for Ukraine. There were just over 48 hours left before the full-scale war. The death timer was already close to the end, or rather, to the beginning of the horror that the Ukrainian people have been living in for 4 years now. Subscribe to our channel and you will see many interesting videos about the anniversary of the attack. We plan to release a whole series of materials dedicated to this topic, as well as the failure of Putin's blitzkrieg. Take care of yourselves and don't let yourselves be fooled by the sweet talk of enemy propaganda. Thank you to all the sponsors for supporting the channel. Thank you to the viewers for watching all the way through. Goodbye, everyone.